Hello everyone, my name is David Kiernan and I'm a Curriculum Officer at NCFE. This webinar will provide you with the approach to awarding our V Cert qualifications for this academic year of 2020-2021. The plan for today's webinar is to provide a summary of the centre strategy that we require and a time frame for submitting teacher assessed grades or tags to us. The different V Cert qualifications that we have, as some of these V Certs have different assessment and delivery models to others. We'll look at the different V Cert models and provide some specific guidance for the tags, how mid-flight learners, such as Year 10 learners, are affected, an overview of the external quality assurance process, and finally, to address the questions that you've submitted to us. We are going to go through a quick overview of what your centre will need to do and when any tags should be submitted to NCFE. Centres will need to produce a strategy for their approach to teacher assessed grades. We'll send you an online form to fill in to simplify this process, and it will include information such as preparing and collating the evidence for tags, how the evidence will be internally quality assured, etc. This form has been aligned to general qualifications. NCFE will review your strategy and provide feedback. Your centre will be allowed to submit tags once the strategy has been approved. You should let your learners know about your approach to tags too. There will be a webinar later today providing guidance for centres around tags and making judgments. It will also be added to our YouTube channel. The tag window will be available between mid-April to mid-June. Tags can be submitted at any point during that window, but you must have your tag strategy approved by NCFE before submitting any tags. We know that centres may have a mix of learners, with those who require a tag and those that completed assessments as normal. To aid with this, you can choose whether the grade being submitted for a learner is a tag or a standard submission when entering the grades on the portal. We are now going to look at the different V Cert qualifications and take a high-level overview of the teacher assessed grades for these qualifications. There are three main groups of V Cert qualifications that carry performance points, which will be the focus of this webinar. There are other V Cert qualifications that are still live that don't carry performance points. And while I won't be specifically naming them, the guidance within this webinar will be equally applicable to them. There are two cash V Certs, which are the Level 2 Technical Award in Health and Social Care and Child Development and Care. These consist of both internally and externally assessed components. The Model 3 V Certs consist of the Level 1 and Level 2 Technical Award in Graphic Design, Interactive Media, and Music Technology. The Model 3 V Certs consist of 4 internally assessed units and an external assessment, or 2 external assessments for Music Technology. The Model 4 V Certs consist of the Level 1/2 Technical Award in Health and Fitness, Business and Enterprise, Engineering, Art and Design, and Performance Skills. These are assessed with an external assessment and the internally assessed Synoptic project. For all of these V Certs, you'll be providing a teacher assessed grade on an assessment level rather than a qualification level. For example, you wouldn't be submitting an overall grade for the V Cert, but instead it would be a grade for the different assessments within the qualification, such as the external assessment and the internally assessed units. We've taken this approach to allow existing qualification aggregation to continue, to support mid-flight learners, and also to support those learners who may wish to improve their assessment grade in a future assessment opportunity. In terms of the external assessment, if learners already have a banked external assessment grade or a centre assessed grade or CAG from the previous academic year, then you don't need to submit a tag. However, a tag can still be submitted for those learners if they were entitled to a resit of an external assessment. For example, if the learners may have improved their grade in a second attempt, then a tag could be submitted for those learners. For the internal assessments, the process is similar to the external assessments, but you should aim to complete as much of the internal assessments as possible. Learners with a banked grade or CAG for an internal assessment don't require a tag. If the learners were entitled to a resubmission, then a tag can be submitted instead. A tag would need to be submitted for each internally assessed unit. For example, the Model 3 V Certs have 4 internally assessed units, which would mean the submission of up to 4 tags for each unit. We are now going to look at more of the specifics when it comes to teacher assessed grades and V Certs. For the Cash and Model 3 V Certs, which are the subject areas of health and social care, child development and care, graphic design, interactive media, and music technology, you should continue to work and gather evidence for the internal assessments. You should have enough evidence in order to reach a judgment on the learner's achievement in the units. If you are unsure about the level of work and evidence generated thus far, then do seek further support and guidance from your external quality assurer, your EQA, who will be happy to advise you. As mentioned earlier, there will also be a webinar today at 3 p.m. around tags and making judgments. It will be added to our YouTube channel if you're unable to attend. You may want to consider booking an EQA review when the learner's work is ready, and following that, give learners a chance to improve their work before the tag deadline and submitting grades. Once you've submitted your learner grades and/or tag submissions on the portal, your EQA review will occur, during which the evidence and assessments will be sampled and discussed. For any incomplete internal assessments, you need to have evidence to base judgments on for any internal assessment. If there is no evidence for a unit, then a tag can't be submitted. This is why it's important to continue to work and generate evidence for the internal assessments. You can use other evidence from activities that also demonstrate learners' competency. For example, any mock external assessments would potentially cover the content from the internally assessed units, any banked unit components already completed, any completed or partially completed internal assessments. Below is an example with graphic design, where the internally assessed Unit 2 and the internally assessed Unit 3 both require learners to select and use technical skills. These could be mapped across both units to provide substantial evidence. It could be learner work produced in center-devised formative tasks that reflect the qualification specification. such as class or homework, internal tests or practice assessments taken by learners, any project work, recordings such as rehearsals for practical performances, witness testimonies or teacher observation records when used in conjunction with other forms of evidence. There's no single type of evidence that's recommended above any other. However, it is expected that you'll take into account contextual factors, such as command words, assessment outcomes, and level, when determining how much notional weight to assign to each piece. If you need further guidance or want to check if you have appropriate evidence for incomplete internal assessments, then do contact your EQA. If your learners require a tag for the external assessment, they must be booked onto the external assessment window first before any tag can be submitted. As mentioned earlier, you don't need to submit a tag for learners that already have a banked grade or a center assessed grade, a CAG. If learners do have a banked grade and would be entitled to a resit, then you can submit a tag. Just like the internal assessments, any tags for the external assessments must be based on evidence. You may decide to use the internal assessments for the majority of this tag evidence. You should examine the evidence that learners have produced in their internal assessments to make a professional judgment on their external assessment tag. There might be one internal assessment in particular that's very similar to what is asked for in the external assessments. There's no singular approach when it comes to using the internal assessments for making external assessment judgments, as every center is different. Your EQA will be best placed to offer support and guidance on how you intend to use the internal assessments for making tag judgments for the external assessment. It's not only internal assessments that can be used to make tag judgments. Other forms of evidence can be used too, from mock external assessments, topic tests, any substantial class or homework, including those that took place during remote learning, etc. We have outlined these 5 stages in our approach to awarding document. Stage 1, consider what has been taught by looking at the overall structure of the qualification specification. Stage 2, collect the evidence and do consider what evidence has been collected across the course of the learner's performance. Stage 3, evaluate the quality of the evidence by considering how useful the evidence is in determining a grade. Stage 4, establish if the available evidence covers everything the learner has learned, as you should only grade each learner on their performance in the subject content that they have evidence for. Stage 5, assign the grade, which should be based on a holistic judgment of the evidence of the learner's performance on the subject content they have been taught, and how this relates to the assessment where the tag is required, be that the external or internal assessments. For the Model 4 V Certs, the internal assessment is the externally set Synoptic project. Previously, there were 2 deadlines to meet, one for an initial submission and another deadline for a resubmission. These have been removed, and you should work towards submitting grades within the tag submission window from mid-April to mid-June. You should continue to work and gather evidence for the Synoptic project as you'll need sufficient evidence to base a judgment on. The quality assurance and resubmission process can be managed within your centre. It also might prove useful to book an EQA review to discuss ongoing work, assessments, internal quality assurance and administration prior to submitting grades. In this way, you could use that initial visit or review to clear up any admin and prevent potential issues, and then use the second visit for a summative review. You need to have evidence for the assessment objectives to base judgments on for the Synoptic project, as you'll need to fill in the grading calculator to determine the Synoptic project grade. This is why it's important, just as I mentioned previously with the other V Certs, to continue to work and generate evidence for the Synoptic project. You can, though, use other evidence from activities that also demonstrate learners' competency. For example, any mock Synoptic projects that they may have done, any practical or skills-based tasks in lessons, which can be used as evidence for the competency for assessment objective 4, demonstrate and apply technical skills. Maybe extended response questions from the external assessments, which might align to assessment objective 3, analyze and evaluate knowledge and understanding. Perhaps from professional discussions, where they've discussed an evaluation of the project instead of completing the learner log for assessment objective 5, manage and evaluate the project. As mentioned with the other V Certs, there's no single type of evidence that's recommended above any other. But it would be useful to engage with your EQA, who'll be able to advise and support you with appropriate evidence for incomplete Synoptic projects, or make use of a support visit. If your learners require a tag for the external assessment, then do book them onto the external assessment window first. As mentioned earlier, you don't need to submit a tag for learners that already have a banked grade or a centre assessed grade. If learners do have a banked grade and would be entitled to a resit, then you can submit a tag. Tags for the external assessment must be based on evidence, and the simplest approach is to use the Synoptic project grade. As the Synoptic project covers the same content as the external assessment would, you can simply use the Synoptic project grade for the external assessment. In other words, the Synoptic project grade is also the external assessment grade. If you think that learners would have performed better in the external assessment than they did in the Synoptic project, then a higher tag can be submitted for the external assessment, but you will need additional evidence to justify that judgment. We'll now discuss mid-flight learners and how awarding may work for them. Mid-flight learners are learners who are in the first year of a 2-year course, such as Year 10 learners. Or, if your centre delivers the V Cert over 3 years, it could be learners in the first or second year of a 3-year course, such as Year 9 or Year 10 learners, for example. These mid-flight learners can have tags submitted for any assessment they would have completed this academic year. In other words, from the 1st of August 2020 to the 31st of August 2021. As mentioned, this is for any assessments, be that external assessments or internal assessments. These tags would still need to be based on evidence though, and your EQA can provide guidance and support for these mid-flight learners too. If you've not been assigned your external quality assurer, your EQA, it might be because you've not registered your learners onto the V Cert qualification, We'll allocate an EQA and email their contact details to the program contact at your centre within 7 working days of the learners being registered. And within 3 working days after that, your EQA will get in touch to introduce themselves. We're going to have a quick overview about the quality assurance process for this academic year. I'm going to break up the quality assurance process into 3 categories: pre-submission of grades, post-submission of grades, and next academic year. So before submitting, you need to have your tag strategy approved. Your EQA will also be available to provide support and guidance to your centre. We'd also recommend having an EQA review of any internal assessments prior to submitting grades or tags on the portal. After submitting the grades on the portal, the EQAs will carry out reviews of the grades submitted. In some cases, they may need additional information before confirming the results submitted. This is why it's useful to engage with your EQA prior to submitting grades. When moving into the next academic year, centres should retain the evidence you have collated to underpin each of the teacher-assessed grades you submit to us this year. This evidence may be required as part of EQA sampling during 2021 to 2022. There will be a webinar in the coming weeks covering information on the EQA process and guidance. We're now going to address some of the questions that you've submitted to us when you registered for this webinar. This question is in relation to music technology and asking if centres need to provide evidence and/or papers for the 2 external exams. You do need to base the external assessments on evidence, but that doesn't have to come from past papers. We have provided examples of evidence types in our approach to awarding document, but you may find the internal assessments useful for making judgments since they'll cover the same content. You will need to submit grades though for both of the external assessments. So you will need to submit a grade or tag for the written external assessment as well as the practical external assessment. So this question is asking what evidence is needed for the tags and if all 4 units need to be completed. So I'm assuming this is in relation to the Model 3 V Certs, which have 4 internally assessed units. And I'm going to address that second part of the question first, if all 4 units need to be completed. Units don't need to be fully completed, but there must be sufficient evidence to make a tag judgment on. If there is a unit that hasn't been taught, then you should identify these areas and make every effort to generate sufficient evidence in the time remaining through continued teaching, learning, and assessment to allow a tag to be submitted. If an internally assessed unit or any assessment component doesn't have a grade or tag submitted, then the qualification can't be awarded. As for the evidence that is needed, there is a wide range that you can use. It is best to consider these 5 stages I mentioned earlier when considering the evidence you have. Do also seek support from your EQA about the evidence that you have if you need any further guidance. We've had a question asking what forms need to be filled in for the internal quality assurance or IQA. We do have forms available on QualHub for you to use, but these forms aren't mandatory. You can devise your own documents or forms, record keeping, etc. Our forms can be found by going to the Policies and Documents section of QualHub and choosing course file documents. What the EQA will want to see, along with the normal centre policies, are an IQA sampling strategy, which provides information on which learners have been sampled, which assessors, etc. There should be feedback from the IQA to the assessor for the learners that have been sampled, with any actions signed off. Records of any standardization activities or meetings. If your centre has written their own assignments for the internal assessments, then it would be good practice to IQA those briefs. This next question is asking why it has taken until now to provide centres with this guidance. So the Ofqual framework for awarding, called the Vocational and Technical Qualification Contingency Regulatory Framework, or just the VCRF for short, was published on Wednesday, the 24th of March, just last week. We had to apply this framework to our qualifications, and we updated our approach to awarding document and email centres on that same day, on the Wednesday, 24th of March. In terms of this webinar, we weren't able to run it on the Wednesday as time was needed to create the presentation for this webinar, allow centres enough time to digest the guidance that has been released, allow time for centres to register and submit any questions that the guidance didn't fully answer or explain, etc. This next question is asking if there will be a definitive list of requirements for successful certification. Firstly, every assessment component will need a grade or tag submitted. If an assessment component, internal or external, isn't graded or given a tag, then the qualification can't be awarded. This is why you should use this time to identify any areas which haven't been taught, what evidence is lacking, seek out support from your EQA, etc. In terms of the evidence, we have published examples of the types of evidence that could be used, stages to consider when using the evidence, etc., to award a tag. The reason we haven't published a list of must-haves is because we don't want to disadvantage centres or learners. For example, if we said that centres must have mock exam results, this might be good for one centre who managed to have mock exams, but not for another who didn't have sufficient time to schedule any. This question is asking whether all learners need to be booked onto the external assessment. There was some further context to this question, as this centre's learners had already sat the November exam, and some of those learners got a level 2 distinction, and they wanted to know if they still needed to book them onto the summer external assessment. So you only have to book learners onto the external assessment if you intend to submit a teacher assessed grade for the external assessment. If learners were given a centre assessed grade, a CAG, last academic year, or have a banked external assessment grade, such as from the November exam, then you don't need to book learners onto the external assessment. The external assessment booking is only for learners that will have a tag submitted for the external assessment. There have been a few questions asking why are we still carrying out EQA reviews? The focus of this question being around the Synoptic project, but the answer I'll give can be applicable to the other qualification areas. Where Synoptic projects continue as normal, as per the Ofqual VCRF regulatory guidance, the centre assessment standards scrutiny still applies and must be undertaken, which means normal EQA activity must take place. Where centres don't complete as normal and submit a tag, then quality assurance still needs to be undertaken as part of the alternative arrangements under the Ofqual VCRF, which means when a tag is submitted, we'll undertake an EQA review. But prior to submitting tags, centres don't have to do an EQA review, but we strongly recommend that centres discuss and book a support visit with their EQA, which will help prepare centres and ensure there are no surprises when it comes to tag submissions. I hope you found this webinar useful, and if you have any further questions, then please go to our COVID-19 response page on NCFE or look at the adaptations document on your QualHub subject page. You can also contact our customer support team, who will be able to provide further help. Do also engage with your EQA for any other support and guidance. Thank you again for attending, and from everyone at NCFE, we wish you a very safe and successful year.